Greetings fellow Mist Wanderers, my name is Steve Morgan and this is DM of the Mists, covering all things Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft. This is a Ravenloft video because we're going to be doing a deep dive into the domain of Valachan. I've done a few of these deep dives, how I ran domain. I started with the Carnival, I've since done Falkovnia, the Sea of Sorrows and Demonio, and now we have Valachan. I'm very excited to do Valachan because we've literally just finished it. I had the last session last week as I record this. So it's very fresh in my mind. It's been the last couple of weeks and months of my time and it just worked really well. I really enjoyed running it and I think the players liked it too. Before I head on, let's address the pronunciation. So in a few other videos you might have heard me say Valachan. This is because I always thought it was pronounced Valachan, but then I saw a few videos where people said Valachan. I think they're referring to the older edition, not that I think that matters necessarily. So I started calling it Valachan in a couple of videos. But then I saw a few more videos where it was talked about primarily in 5th edition and by someone who worked on Valachan and for the Valachan's Guide to Ravenloft, and they said Valachan, not Valachan. So I'm going to go with what I originally said and what I've said to my players for the last however many months, Valachan. Also, this t-shirt, I know it's very on the nose, given what the words wild and heart mean to a jungle place like Valachan with the Trial of Hearts, but they are one of my favourite ever rock bands. They're based in the north of England. I kind of call them the British Guns N' Roses, so check them out if you want to. I didn't get this especially for this. I've got like 4 or 5 of their t-shirts. I'm a big fan of theirs. I'm going to give my usual disclaimer. This is a sort of ideas dump video. The whole point of this is that if you're thinking of running Valachan, I tell you how I did it, what I included, and maybe you can borrow some of it and adapt it and use it in your game. It's not necessarily, you see some videos and some guides that say you can do this running from like level 3 to level 7. This isn't that, although arguably with this video compared to some of the others, you probably could, because it kind of runs in quite a linear fashion. And I think some of the stuff I put in my game, you could run it in the way that I've run it and, you know, adapt it to whatever level your players are and it might work well. And also I should mention, this assumes that you have some knowledge of the domain already. Maybe you've read about it in Valachan's Guide to Ravenloft. I'm not going to do what some other videos do, where they'll go into detail about what Valachan is, who the Darklord is. I'm going to assume you know that already and that you're coming into this with a bit of knowledge of what Valachan is and who the Darklord is, etc. And I also tend to sometimes go off on tangents, so I'll start talking about Mist Wanderers like Rudolph van Richten and the Weathermay Foxgrove twins, both of whom appeared in this when I ran this domain. So as well, if I start talking about stuff and you don't know what it is, then I suggest you look it up in Valachan's Guide to Ravenloft. Okay, I borrowed from a lot of other 5th edition sources for this one, so I have to give some warnings for spoilers. For example, when I ran the Sea of Sorrows, I borrowed a lot from Ghosts of Saltmarsh, because that's a seafaring campaign. For this one, I borrowed a lot from Tomb of Annihilation. I didn't borrow any of the maps or any of the story, but I did borrow NPC art. So I took the art of the NPCs in Tomb of Annihilation and fit them to be NPCs in Valachan. And I also borrowed a lot of monsters as well. There are spoilers for one of the adventures from Tales from the Yawning Portal. I ran the Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan, which I thought, with a little bit of tweaking, is perfect and fits really well with Valachan and what it's about. There's also a few really minor ones for Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel. I borrowed some NPC art from one of the adventures. Ghosts of Saltmarsh, I used an appendix adventure for an underwater shipwreck and the map for that and the info for that. And I borrowed at least one monster as well. And Curse of Strahd, I borrowed a monster from that. Feels a bit weird saying spoilers for Curse of Strahd because people watching this probably know Curse of Strahd well, but just in case. And it's not just spoilers for you, it could be potential spoilers for your players as well. So for example, if you decide to borrow all the monsters from Tomb of Annihilation and your players have literally just played that, or they're wanting to play it one day, then that might make things awkward. So in my case, I asked my players, have you ever done a Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan? Have you ever done Tomb of Annihilation? No? Great. Let's move on to resources. So the obvious one is Valachan's Guide to Ravenloft, has information on Valachan for 5th edition. It's no longer Urik who's the Darklord, but Urik does appear, and I really like the way he's included, which I'll talk about later. He had a great role in the campaign as well. But yeah, so the information from Valachan's Guide to Ravenloft, including the Trial of Hearts. However, there's a set of Adventurers League modules for Ravenloft called Ravenloft Mist Hunters. I know there's some people who don't like Adventurers League, and I know there's some people who don't like Mist Hunters. From people I know who've seen all of the Mist Hunter stuff, they say the 2 modules for Valachan are really good, and I really enjoyed them as well. They're called The Deadliest Game and Scion of Darkness. and they are both, they basically essentially cover the Trial of Hearts. So there's only a little bit of information in Van Richten's guide, but in these two Mist Hunters modules, you essentially have it all laid out. You have all the encounters, all the monsters, potential NPCs they see and their names and what they're like. It's great. So if you are thinking of running Trial of Hearts, I heavily recommend that. I also love in one of them, it's got lots of Guns N' Roses references. For example, one of the chapters is called Welcome to the Jungle, another's called We've Got Fun and Games, and so on, with the lyrics of that song. There's a bunch of people who do expanded map packs for Mist Hunters. I think I recommended them for one of my other videos. I forget which off the top of my head, for Kovnia. They've also done for the Valachan modules, so I found that really handy. They're quite small. I guess you could expand the size of some of them, just make them a little bit bigger. But I found them to be really handy for all of the Trial of Hearts, all the different encounters for that. So Tomb of Annihilation has some great monster suggestions. I'll talk more about that when I talk about random encounters. And I also repurposed a lot of the NPC art. So there's a lot of NPCs in there of people who I thought would make work for some of the Valachan, the Shuaran and Oselo people, NPCs. I'll talk about all those as I go through it. Tales from the Yawning Portal, the adventure Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan, which I understand is like one of the earliest D&D adventures. That's obviously been adapted for 5th edition for Tales of the Yawning Portal. That is, as I said a few minutes ago, with a little bit of tweaking, it works really well and fits really well in Valachan. So Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel, as I said as well, is I introduced a character called Yaguara, and there's some great art for her. She's got a pet parrot as well. She was like a Shuaran guide, so borrowed that from one of the adventures. I think it's one of the adventures near the back of the book, near the end of Radiant Citadel. Borrowed a lot, as always, from Mistopedia, that's the Fraternity of Shadows website wiki, Ravenloft wiki, etc. And they worked really well for the older information about Urik. Really helped me to give him personality, understand what he was like in the older editions. And a lot of them borrow from the Ravenloft Gazetteer. I think it's number 4 is the one that has a lot of Valachan info. There's an old Dungeon magazine. Dungeon Magazine 50 had a Ravenloft and a Valachan-centered adventure called Falkovik's Cat. And that had a map in it as well of his old castle, which I'll talk about later. In 5th edition, it just talks about the ruins of the castle, and Chakuna builds Pantara Lodge above it. But I actually remade Castle Pantara in Dungeon Draft and made that free as well, available on like Reddit. So I'll talk about that later, and I'll link to it in the description, all that jazz. And I didn't really use it much, but I like to sometimes see what other people have put out on DM's Guild. And there's a series of adventures called Carnival of Lost Souls, and one of their adventures is called Valachan Hunter's Moon. That was pretty cool. I looked at it. I don't think I borrowed a lot from it, but it was just kind of cool to get that and sort of see how what their spin on Valachan was as well. So I recommend maybe, if you want to look at some other sources as well, you might want to pick that up. For the map, I used the one from Van Richten's guide. Now in Van Richten's guide, they say, in addition to Shuaran and Oselo, which are the 2 main settlements, there is also a lizard folk settlement. I didn't use that, and that's important later on towards the end of adventure, which I don't want to spoil right now. But when I talk about the end of adventure later, it makes sense that there's just the 2 main settlements. I used the expanded map pack for the Trial of Hearts, as already mentioned. I used 2 maps from a map maker called the Mad Cartographer. They did Pantara Lodge, which I think looks fantastic, and Yaguara's Heart as well for the final dungeon. The rest, as I go through, I will show them, or I'll mention them, or I'll link to them from the description. I probably won't bother with some of the more generic jungle ones. They're just from Reddit, available for free from Reddit or other places. So I probably won't go to the effort of say, this is the jungle map I use, this is just a generic jungle map. I'm sure there's plenty out there you can grab. For music, as always, I'm a big fan of Tabletop Audio. He's got a few cool songs that I thought worked really well for Valachan. For the beginning of this video, I've been playing Invisible Mountain, which is what I use for the world map travel. So when I show the Valachan map and they're traveling from settlement to settlement or dungeon to dungeon, but not for the Trial of Hearts, I use something different for that, which I'll talk about in a minute. For the villages, I use Jungle Shaman, which is just kind of cool and chilled jungle music. For Pantara Lodge and Castle Pantara, I use Jungle Ruins, which is similar jungle kind of music, but a little creepier. For the Trial of Hearts, I used Rope Bridge, but I used the music-only version because, yeah, it probably is like, you probably could include like a rope bridge at some point, like that classic Indiana Jones moment, any kind of jungle adventure, but the sound of the creaking ropes would be a bit much if it was constantly played throughout. So I used the music-only version. It's quite cool, jungly sound, but quite intense, kind of fast, I wouldn't say fast-paced music, but you get what I mean. It kind of keeps the pace fast. and keeps the players thinking, right, we gotta keep moving. For the Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan and Yaguara's Heart, there's a song called Lost Mine, which I think is intended for Lost Mine of Phandalba, but sometimes I just like to play it for some of the dungeons. A little bit creepy, a little bit keep them on their toes. For Chakuna's theme, I use Battle of the Amazons. I use this actually for Vladeska in Full Covenant as well, but it's a lot more fitting for Chakuna. The regular version has the sounds of women fighting, which I guess you could use because when there was the fight with Chakuna later on, it's her plus some werepanthers. Who I think I had it that her like sort of werepanther, not servants, what's the word I'm looking for, bodyguards and fellow hunters were women, so that could work well. But I tend to just like, I tend to use some of the music only versions just because they're a little less distracting, and for the purposes of this video I'll just use music only versions. And for escaping Valachan, I used a song called Dungeon Escape, which I thought was really intense and really, again, pressure to keep, you gotta get out of here kind of music. As I go through this video, you might see a little text box appear saying now playing song, and I'll play some of the music throughout the video. For random encounters, I borrowed a lot from Tomb of Annihilation, as I said. Actually, to be honest with you, I borrowed a lot from the suggestions in my Richten's Guide and Mist Hunters, but what I liked about Tomb of Annihilation is that they've got some really interesting and unique monsters in there, such as, I'll show a few here, Albani, they're like lobster people. Chikuli, which are like sort of large camouflage snakes. Kamadan, which are leopards with snakes on their heads, that's pretty rad. Man traps, which are evil plants that can lure people and then just try and eat them basically. And Sioux monsters, which just look like the evil demon monkeys. And then, as I said, I used the suggestions from Richten's Guide, such as chimeras, displacer beasts, harpies, peritons, evil plant monsters, and so on. One thing I didn't really do, except for the final encounter of the Trial of Hearts, which I took from the Mist Hunters, is I didn't include dinosaurs. I saw in PhD&D's video on Valachan that he says it's kind of, it doesn't feel very Ravenlofty. It kind of takes, I guess, it's a little bit immersion break. I don't know. I felt like I had to include the one at the end of the Trial of Hearts because that was really interesting, unique spin on having a dinosaur in Valachan, but I didn't include dinosaurs as standard, similar to Dr. Bowers at PhD&D. In terms of hooks, I've said this before in some of my other videos, I feel like this is the weakest part of my videos when I try and help people because my hooks were very specific to my game, and I appreciate that if I tell you my hooks, you might say, well, I can't really do anything about that. And that's probably going to be the case of 2 out of 3 of the hooks I'm going to say in a minute. One of them was a PC, I had the PC from Full Covenant, and they had a few NPC allies, and one of them had gone missing, and they assumed that he had been spirited away by the mist somewhere, and one of the NPC allies, I think it was Jennifer Weathermay Foxgrove, had a theory, or maybe it's Valachan. Maybe he's stuck in Valachan. So that kind of gave them a thinking, maybe we should check out his Valachan places at some point. I also had, so before running a wider Ravenloft campaign, I ran Curse of Strahd, Rictavio, Dr. Rudolf van Richten was their fated ally, and I had it that played the epilogue in Curse of Strahd where he leaves to go back home to Mordant, to his shop in Mordantshire, the town there. However, when my players then went to see him in there and bumped into Weathermay Foxgrove twins, they said, we've not seen him in months, which suggests to them that something happened to him between leaving Barovia and arriving at Mordant. And what happened is the mist sent him off course into Valachan, and he decided to stay there. So where one time at the carnival, there's this family who say they were from Darkon, but when they escaped Darkon, because there's no leader at the moment, they could leave the mists and course out for Darkon there. They said that they got stuck in Valachan instead, and this man rescued them, and he was so eager to get everyone out to safety through the mist border out to Valachan, but he didn't want to leave himself. He wanted to stay, he wanted to help more people. And they said, the mum of the family was pregnant, and she's going to call her, whether it's a boy or a girl, she's going to call it Rudy. And one of my players immediately picked up and said, is that in honor of Rudolf van Richten? And they're like, yeah, that was the name of the guy who rescued us. And then that was the sort of connecting the dots that made them realise that's where he ended up. We got to go rescue him, because they know he probably doesn't need rescuing because he had opportunities to leave. So they're wondering why he's decided to stay in Valachan, and that gets revealed when they finally meet him. And the third thing as well, there was a whole business with Rictavio's tiger in Barovia in Curse of Strahd. Long story short, he escaped, attacked some Vistani. There was a Vistani trial. Rictavio was found innocent due to insufficient evidence, but they decided they were going to, rather than put the tiger down, they were going to send it off to this place called Markovia, where it could be re-educated. And then after leaving Brovia, after defeating Strahd, they went to Markovia before going to Volkovnia, and they found the tiger, and it was now intelligent, it could talk, and this happened before it left Barovia, but then my players and Richten were trying to get the tiger to, instead of hunting Vistani, were trying to get it to hunt the undead. So it had a lust for undead, which worked really well in Volkovnia, Zombieland. But yes, there was a theory that, you know, this tiger was looking for its family. If I say Resef Jr. at any point, I might just accidentally slip that out. That was what they named the tiger, because there was a past PC in Curse of Strahd called Resef, who was a Tabaxi, decided to name it after him. So just wanted to mention that in case I just say Resef Jr. and there's no context and you're like, what? And yes, so they wondered if he was from Valachan and if his family might be there. So that was another lead to go to Valachan. So they had 3 solid reasons to go to Valachan. So they decided to go there. In terms of the adventure itself, it was kind of split into 3 parts or acts. I did a Reddit post where I said, this is how I'm thinking, how I'm thinking of running Valachan. What do you think? If you've got any advice. So there's kind of a text version of this video if you want, or this video probably goes a lot deeper and covers a lot more ground, but I'll include a link to the description to that if you want to read that or want to reference anything from this video in there. But it's essentially split into 3 parts. There's pre-trial, there are a few adventures, they arrived at Shuaran, were given a few quests. The trial, they get drafted into, and all of that, where I borrow heavily, pretty much run it straight out of Mist Hunters. And then post-trial, they meet Urik von Kharkov, the past Darklord. They go to the ruins of his castle. They go to Yaguara's heart and find out how to defeat Chakuna. And I will cover each of those in turn. Pre-trial then. They arrived into the domain by ship. They have the Relentless from Pietra van Ries. They defeated her and took her ship. And it does a lot of funky stuff, which I'll explain as when we get to those points. And as soon as they arrived in the domain, I described that they see the jungle and straight away these flying creatures start attacking them, and it was Peritons, and I used the monstrous Periton as kind of like the boss of them from Ghosts of Saltmarsh, I think that's from, and then smaller Periton as well. And there was a battle on the ship deck, which is pretty cool. It was pretty much, welcome to Valachan, roll initiative. They heard about, actually, I think, before going there, that there was a settlement on the coast. They were like, great, as soon as we arrive, we'll try and find the settlement on the coast. And they find the village of Shuaran. So for the Elder, who I called Elder Tenok, I used the Tomb of Annihilation art for an NPC called Grandfather Sitembe. They arrived and explained who they were and explained that they were looking for various people. And they were assigned a guide. And this was Urana, who the art and the info I borrowed from Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel. She's got a pet parrot called Nene as well. I gave her the scout stat block, which is weak-ish, so the players would have to make sure they looked after her well, make sure she didn't die. And then for the other Shuaran people, I used the tribal warrior stat block, not that it came up, but it was nice to have something just in case. So they were given a bit of lore about the domain. They were told something about a prophecy. They were told somebody from outside Valachan would come and save the Valachan people, which would obviously end up being the PCs. They referred to people quite ambiguously. So they referred to the hunter, that was Chakuna. The herbalist was Van Richten. And they also referred to the warrior and the beast. And it turned out the warrior was the missing NPC ally of the one PC from Volkovnia, who was another Volkovnia Talon soldier, who was also a fellow Genasi, because my PC's an Air Genasi and this one's an Earth Genasi. They saw this man who was an Earth Genasi, and connections to the earth and flowers and plants, and they were like, I probably borrowed from a lot of fantasy and sci-fi where, like thinking of Star Wars where C-3PO was hailed as like a god, that kind of thing. And they thought he was there for the prophecy. He helped them with a few things and then said he wanted to leave, and they decided to imprison him. And he broke a law, and the players find out later on, or it's never really clearly stated, but it's very strongly insinuated that the law that he broke is they didn't want him to leave because they were worried that they treated him as sort of like a good luck charm. And that was the same with the Beast as well. The Beast was quite a fun one. This might be a bit silly for people who want to play strictly horror and Ravenloft, but I bought a monsters pack from D&D Beyond called Misplaced Monsters Volume 1, where the proceeds go to, I think it's a children's hospital in Seattle, where they got some children there to draw some monsters, and then they created stat blocks for them. And one of them was called Dandelion. And Dandelion was essentially this magical lion from the Feywild. and I had it that he was one of the other. So basically, this Earth Genasi Talon soldier and this Feywild lion were both imprisoned, and the players were told if they wanted to release them, they would do a deal. So the deal that the Elder said was, if you help us with 3 things that cause us problems, we'll release the 2 of them. And the 3 quests they were given, and I'll go into more details of these one by one in a minute. They'd heard that there was a dangerous iron golem inside the shipwreck of the Helbenik. There are howling apes from Yakum Beach, that's mentioned in Van Richten's guide. I used the Guralan stat blocks for those, so those kind of like, not proper apes, but they look like giant 4-armed gorillas. I think they're treated as like monstrosities or something. And there's a shrine to the north of the Crying Dolphin River. This isn't on the map, I just kind of added it to the map, and that's the setup for the hidden shrine of Tamoachan. I used this map from the cages that I found on Reddit for just jungle cages, and it was ideal just in case anything happened, like they tried to spring them, tried to release them, but they were taken to the cages to see their friend. And out of game, the player and this NPC had, you know, from the PC joining the game to finally seeing this NPC was about 2 years. So the 2 years out of this game, this PC was like, I gotta find my friend, and finally found the friend, which is great. Filled them in on everything. Oh, Valachan's dead now, by the way, and there's no more zombies, and you missed all that kind of thing. They stayed the night there. They were told that the jungle's dangerous, but if you help us with these quests, you're welcome to stay here in our village. So they had a long rest there, and the next day they got started with the quests. In terms of traveling through the jungle, because they had Yaguara the guide with them, I had it that she had a map, so you could show them the whole map then, and she could fill them in on any lore, information about places, and so on that she knew. You know, she wouldn't spill the beans on everything necessarily, or me as the DM wouldn't spill the beans on everything, but kind of handy that she might be able to help a little bit. And in terms of travel, I used what it says in Van Richten's guide, and I think Mist Hunters as well, where it says speed through the jungle is halved because it's considered difficult terrain. So at normal pace, instead of 3 miles an hour, it's 1.5 miles an hour. So very slow movement through the jungle. Their ship meant they could, some of the properties I gave this magic ship, the Relentless, where it could teleport around within a domain, even to like lakes and stuff. So that kind of helped them out a lot. I should stress, I know that's making the game easier for them, but we're at the point now in the campaign where they've done a lot of just sort of land travel, if you will. And it kind of did make some of traveling through Valachan a lot easier, but where I placed the temple north of the Crying Dolphin River, they had no choice but to, you know, I said that they couldn't teleport through rivers or travel along rivers, so they still had to walk for that. I went to the wreck of the Helbenik first. I used the map and the information from Ghosts of Saltmarsh. In the appendix section, it has information about shipwreck and sort of like a main adventure plus tweaked adventures you could use. And there is actually an iron golem in one of the adventures, which is what gave me the idea, but I completely changed it. I think in the original, in Ghosts of Saltmarsh, there's some people there who are trying to like steal the iron golem, but what I had is, I used this map as well, I should mention, a fan-made map. So I didn't use the map from the book, but used one that somebody else had made. I'll share the link in the description, where they had to, the statue was the iron golem, plot twist. So when they were trying to, looking around and stuff, the statue came to life, and then they had to fight this statue under the water. I also, before they went under, there's a harpy nest nearby. I think that's in the original adventure info. So I used this harpy map, a harpy nest map, and I think there was something like 8 harpies or something they had to fight off before going under the water, just in case. One of their NPCs couldn't go under the water, so they were worried that if they just leave them there standing on the shoreline, the harpies would kill it. So they were like, let's just take out the harpies first. The PCs and their NPC allies actually had caps of water breathing. They were given by Bjorn in Volkovnia, so that kind of came in handy. And they fought and defeated the Iron Golem, but sadly they didn't come across the Talking Crab, or I think it's like an Iron Cobra or something, or they didn't come across much other stuff under the ship. They just defeated the Iron Golem and kind of left again. Shortly after that, they travelled, sort of teleported to the shoreline near Yakum Beach. If I can find it, I used this map for the jungle shoreline, and I put 5 Guralians. Let me just double check. Actually, I just checked the pronunciation on D&D Beyond. They got the cool thing where Matt Mercer and other people do the voices, and it's Giralon. I put 5 Giralons on the shoreline. They were attacking from a distance, and they rolled a high enough stealth that the Giralons didn't pick them up, so they kind of had one round where they could hurl a fireball and things like that, and then these guys came charging. They've got a speed of 40 anyway, and they can also, as a bonus action, essentially dash. So they were like attacking from a distance, and all of a sudden they just closed the gap. I'm like, oh. But yeah, that was kind of a quick but fun battle. Then the third thing was the Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan. So I thought they would long rest between doing those 2 encounters and then doing Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan. But because very little time had passed, and because they didn't take much damage from the other 2 battles, or they'd healed up. Actually, they took a fair bit of damage, I think, from the Iron Golem, but not from the Giralons and the Harpies. They decided to do it all in the same day. So I was like, uh-oh. That's a lot to do in one day if you get stuck in the dungeon in Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan. On the way, there was a random encounter of Chakulis. They're the camouflage snakes I mentioned earlier. And the setup for Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan is when they were close to it, one of the people, I rolled at random, and it was unfortunately Yaguara, the weak scout, got grabbed by the assassin vine. And then 3 bullets appeared. So they had a bit of a fun time fighting these bullets and the assassin vine. I think one person got downed. The bullets are pretty tough, actually, especially if they roll like a natural 20. They saved their friend who got grabbed by the assassin vine. And at this point, it's felt a bit railroady, but it is how the adventure starts, is they kind of fall into the dungeon. So I had it that after defeating the bullets, Yaguara says that like there's dozens, if not hundreds, of plant creatures all start approaching them. And she's like, quick, this way, we're nearly at the shrine, we can, hide there. And as they're running, the ground collapses because the bullets have made it weak underneath because of their tunneling, and they fall into the Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan. And what I like about the Hidden Shrine of Tamoachan is that's the start of the dungeon. So it's the reverse of the classic dungeon delve. Instead of starting at the entrance of the dungeon and going deeper, you start at the bottom, at the lowest, furthest way point, and you've got no choice but to find your way out and get out. So that was a lot of fun. It's got some really unique monsters as well. So there is, I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of this, an amphispina, which I think is in classic mythology, is a 2-headed snake, but the second head is at the end of the tail. There was a centaur mummy, which I was really sad they didn't come across. There's a giant crayfish, giant lightning eel. There's a giant hermit crab called Calcakilla, Nereid, I think it's pronounced, which is kind of like this sort of sea woman. Kind of makes me think of like a siren, that kind of thing. And I am not even going to pronounce it. I'll just put words here. But essentially a giant snail, the Lord of Snails. Some of the battles, some are quite quirky. I think giant crayfish is going around protecting the giant hermit crab, speaking in a language, and one of my characters cast comprehend languages, and this giant crayfish was waving a claw at them saying, "You must get out of here!" And they were just, my players are like, all right then, sorry, didn't mean to offend you. So it's quite funny how like some of the monsters are just kind of quirky, some of them are, essentially really dangerous. And because my players are like level 13 at the moment, albeit there's only 2 of them, and some of their NPCs are quite weak, I upped the difficulty for some of it. One example was sometimes they come across some baboons. I changed those to the Sioux monsters from Tomb of Annihilation. I also reflavoured some of it to be Valachan themed. So the cool thing about it is there's a were-jaguar statue, which, you could, it's got like a scar across its heart as well. That's just perfect for Valachan. So I repurposed, I said instead of it being a were-jaguar, it was a were-panther. And then it had a scar across its chest, as if its heart was missing. And there's also a vampire in the Tamoachan. So I had it, they didn't come across the vampire, but if they had done, I would have tried to have it tie some connection to the fact that Urik is a vampire / werepanther. So it's kind of, and it was just good to sort of, it didn't feel like I was just kind of like dumping this dungeon and being like, oh, it's jungle themed, it's similar. It felt like I was actually like tying it to the domain and making it feel a lot more sort of believable that it was there. It was a fun dungeon to run. It's one of those that was quite labyrinthian, and it's unlikely the players are going to find everything. Or they might take, there's like 3 corridors to go to one direction, so they'll obviously only wander down one of them. And there's some really quirky, interesting traps as well. Very sort of classic Indiana Jones style, jungle, temple kind of traps. And the most dangerous one my players came across was a rolling millstone. So essentially like the rolling boulder down the stairs that downed at least one NPC and just took chunks of HP off everyone. I would have given them the opportunity to cast like, I don't know, one of them has enlarge reduce, they could have reduced the size of it, and that would have made it so that it would have affected fewer people and maybe it'd be done less damage. But it rolled a really high, it's got a wildly high initiative. I think you give it like a +10 or something like that. So it went first, and it's got a really fast speed as well. So they were doomed. And they left halfway through the dungeon as well, because so it's kind of like a massive, the lowest floor is huge, and then there's 2 a mid and an upper floor which are smaller, and right at the end of the lower floor there's a gap to the outside. Now I could have changed it, I could have removed it, but I gave them the option then. Because they were higher level, they had magic and certain abilities that would mean that they could potentially get out of that hole, and they did. They used Wind Walk to escape through the ceiling gap, and then they bypassed the mid and the upper levels of the dungeon, which I wasn't too upset about because we had fun with what we had. And then they get outside, they get to the shrine, they defeat the giant hyena, which was kind of the whole purpose of the thing. They were told, you've got to look after the shrine. We've heard reports that there's some monster terrorizing it, and it's a giant hyena. And I think they were expecting like this huge boss fight, and then they just killed it in like one round, and they're like, oh, okay. And that was it. So they did their 3 quests. They went back to the village. Their friends got released, with Dandelion leaving to go to the Feywild. It was quite funny because at that point I thought they might leave Valachan and come back later to get their Folkovnia friend home to Folkovnia, and my PC was like, no, you're going to help us out now with the rest of Valachan. And he's like, oh, okay. At that point they talked to the Elder and said, we found this old temple. It looks like it might have ties to Werepanthers and Chakuna maybe. And the Elder says, maybe you should speak to the herbalist. That's what we call him, the old man, the herbalist. We know that he's got some interest in Chakuna. Maybe we can all bang our heads together and figure this out. But he was last sighted near Oselo, so maybe go to Oselo and see if they've seen him. So they get on their ship, they teleport to the lake near Oselo. They go to Oselo. I think I planted a Kamadan battle on the way. That's the leopards with the snakes on their heads. They have like a sleep breath attack, but everyone passed their saving throws. I was gutted. One person could have failed, so one person could fall asleep to just make them realise, oh god, that's scary if we'd all been fallen knocked asleep. But no, the dice failed me that day. They get to Oselo. I used this map for Oselo. I explained with both the Shuaran map and the Oselo map that this wasn't the entire village, because it looks quite small and you'd think that, there's only a few buildings on each. I just kind of said that, this is just kind of part of it, in case they thought, oh, is there really only like 4 buildings and, we're like 10 people live here. Then they finally, after years out of game of not seeing him, they finally saw Rudolf van Richten. I used his stat block from Curse of Strahd, and first of all there's some very interesting reactions, because this is his first time seeing Jennifer Weathermay Foxgrove since before he left his shop in Mordant, and his immediate reaction was, oh my god, is Laurie okay? Why isn't she with you? You two are twins, you guys are inseparable. And she explained, I should explain, I did this whole thing with a second Torhocker reading, and similar to the top reading to Curse of Strahd, where you get a fated ally, and Jennifer ended up being drawn as the fated ally. So they had to convince Laurie and Jennifer to separate as well. So Laurie's back at the shop in Mordenshire and Jennifer's with my players. And also Van Richten saw the tiger that he trained to attack Vistani, and that tiger now can talk and is intelligent and understands why what Van Richten did was very wrong. So that was quite interesting as well, and had Van Richten apologise to this very wise tiger. So Van Richten explains that he willingly decided to stay in Valachan because he was curious about Chakuna's nature. So in Curse of Strahd, it makes out that Strahd is Van Richten's big final score, if you will, his one last job before he retires. And the players help him, and he does that. And then he was going to retire in Mordant, but when he accidentally gets stuck in Valachan and he hears about this Darklord that, even if she's killed, comes back, he was like, I've got to know about this. I've got to understand why and how. And the reason he's spending time with the Oselo is to try and get insider info, because that was her home village. There's mentioned in Van Richten's Guide, there's an initiation ceremony where in Oselo people only accept people to stay with them if they can survive in the jungle without any weapons and stuff. And Van Richten's a smart enough guy that I said that he passed it, because he probably would do. The expert monster hunter and herbalist as well. So he could as well as having probably healing spells, he would be able to just knock together a few herbs and plants and heal himself and stuff. I also had Erasmus van Richten, his dead teenage son. In the Mistwanderer section in Van Richten's Guide, it says that he is there, and I had him haunting him. Van Richten's Guide suggests that he's a ghost. I changed it to poltergeist, because poltergeists are automatically invisible. And I like the whole idea that Erasmus is haunting Van Richten, but sort of very, I don't want to say not stealthily, what's the word I'm looking for? Van Richten thinks it's the Dark players playing a trick on him, trying to torment him. So Erasmus would kind of only help if things were desperate. But he had an invisible person helping out, and anytime he did an attack it was advantage because he's invisible and stuff like that, which is pretty good. And Erasmus was then essentially another person who joined the party. And they all decided to go back to Shuaran together in order to discuss what to do about Chakuna. And another thing, before they left Oselo, I had Chakuna's mum I used the name and the art for Xanthi from Tomb of Annihilation. I said that was Chakuna's mum, and that's kind of revealed to them that, oh god, that's the Darklord's mum, and she's just like, if you see my daughter, tell her I said hi. She's a lovely girl, she's brave and she's strong. We love her for everything she's done for us and stuff like that. They go back to the ship, they fill Van Richten in on the way of their adventures since they last saw him in Barovia, go back to Shuaran, and as the Elder and Van Richten see each other for the first time in a while, somebody comes running in and says, she's here! Chakuna is here. And they go outside and see Chakuna, and I played up to Chakuna. I think this is probably different to how it's described in Van Richten's guide, and also Mist Hunters. I think they describe her as being quite strong and tall. I like the idea of her being quite petite and unassuming, I guess. Like you see this sort of this small woman, athletic, but not very like strong in terms of athletic, but not very, very muscly. But she's petite, and you think, how did she topple the previous Darklord? I really like that kind of vibe. So I described that she's like this late teens, a similar age to Yaguara, to Jennifer Weathermay Foxgrove. They also had Victor Valakovich from Curse of Strahd as an ally, so also a similar age to them, and she's just very sort of confident and rocks up to Shuaran with a few werepanthers and her pet, displaced beast Yana. And I realised then at that point I had Yana and Urana, because I borrowed Urana from a different adventure, and I thought, oh, I could have changed the names on one of them. But, you know, it was what it was. And Chakuna explains that she has 9 participants for the next Trial of Hearts. She needs 6 more. Urana, it's your turn to fight. And Urana starts crying and begs, please, not me. Please, I don't want to die. And Chakuna says, I'll let you off if someone else volunteers in your place. And both my players straight away said, we'll volunteer. Van Richten volunteers. And she said, right, that takes us to 12. We need 3 more. And they had 4 NPC allies with them at that point, and they had to decide which 3 would go with them. And they left Octavio's tiger behind, the intelligent talking tiger, and they took with them Victor Valakovich, Jennifer Weathermay Foxgrove, and the Earth Genasi Talon from Volkovnia, and Erasmus came along for the ride as well. Chakuna says, we're travelling to the lodge right now. You know, I want you there tonight anyway, you might as well come with us. I know you've got a teleporting ship, but just come with us. And they agreed, and they all left to go to the lodge. Oh, before they left, Urana said 4 people from Shuaran have already volunteered. One of them is my cousin, just to let you know, and that'll come important in a minute. And when they travelled to the lodge, I asked them if they could talk to Chakuna or the Werepanthers. They asked Chakuna about her pet displacer beast. She said her name's Urana. Yana. See? Damn. One thing I liked for flavour as well, as they said, that as Chakuna leads the way through the jungle ascension parts, and moves out of her way, and she can move through at a regular pace, and they could walk at a fast pace then as well, to go from Shuaran to Pantara Lodge. Pantara Lodge, I used the Mad Cartographer map, which I thought was fantastic. It looks great. I had it at the sort of big building to the left. It was a stables, so I put some sleeping displacer beasts in there. There's a couple of secret doors. One of them goes to Urik's head, and one of them has a pile of money and a treasure chest in it. Put some treasure there, which they did find later on, post Trial of Hearts. The great thing about the Mist Hunters modules, it takes a lot of the hard work from doing the Trial of Hearts out. It does it for you. And it has the 9 other participants. So there's 4 people from Shuaran called the Cuspici, and for 3 of them I used, for all 4 of them actually, I used Tomb of Annihilation artwork for different NPCs. 3 of them were humans. I had one of them as a tabaxi. And the Mist placed are so much fun. So the other 5 participants in the other team are essentially a mix of people who have sort of stumbled in from the Mists and formed a group between them. There is a Vistana human bard who's, I think it's kind of suggested she's exiled. There's a human pirate. I had it that he was from the Sea of Sorrows. A half-elf archer who I think is from the Sword Coast. So there was a connection there with one of the players from the Sword Coast. And there's a Gif and a Thrikreen as well. So the Gifs are the hippo people. Thrickreens are like insect people as well. They are given their own stat blocks, their own personalities, their own goals and reasons for being in Valachan, how they ended up there. And I just had a lot of fun. The Gif I had, in a deep voice like this, would talk about how he was once on a ship that sailed through the starry skies between planets, and all the other people are whining about being like, yeah, you and your crazy stories. Or this guy's nuts, we love it. Thinking that he's just lying. Thrikreen, I had it that he could only talk through like Thrikreen language, where he's kind of like doing insect noises, but he could actually speak common, and was just pretending. So a bit like Silent Bob. Spoiler alert for Kevin Smith movies. This character's called Silent Bob, but he does actually talk very, very rarely and occasionally. I use just the standard art for those guys from when you see GIF and Thrikreen in the Monster Manual or where they live. And then for the Bard, the Pirate, the Archer, I just grabbed from the art I like from Google Images. And then the Bard is a Bard stat block. The Pirate is the Swashbuckler. I think that's from Volo's Guide maybe, and Monsters of the Multiverse, and the Archer as well. And I just, like I said, different personalities. For those three, I had that the Bard she was quite sort of cheeky and in your face, and trying to find out your secrets or get you to say something you shouldn't. The Pirate, I just had this like kind of very quiet but very intense, looking like staring daggers, essentially, like looking at the players as if right now he wants to kill them. So once the trial starts, and the Archer I played is very sort of quiet, pensive, and not much of a talker, but friendly enough. If he's not firing a bow and arrow, he doesn't really care. They were given a chance to meet the competitors first of all and come up with a team name, as well as the misplaced, as I just explained, who were at least two of them were coming across as quite dodgy and friendly. One of them introduces themselves as Urana's cousin. I used the name in the module, which is Telako, in the Miss Hunters module, I should say. And because of the connection with Urana, she says, why don't we suggest a truce? Apparently this trial, once it starts, we can attack each other. I suggest we just don't attack. We've been training a long time for this. We volunteered ourselves for this Trial of Hearts so that other Shuaran people didn't have to. The players mentioned they took Urana's place. She said, thank you so much. That means a lot to us. All the more reason for us. We don't want to hurt you. If you don't want to hurt us, we'll stay out of each other's way. We'd rather either we win or you win. We don't want the misplaced to win. At least somebody can win so that we can learn more about Chakuna along the way. In terms of the rules, so at that point Chakuna explains the rules, and I borrowed the rules from Valachan's Guide and Mist Hunters, which I won't go into in too much detail, but it's essentially, once the trial starts, you can attack each other. You can't help other people in other teams. Chakuna can change the rules at whim. Breaking of the rules is punishable by death, blah, blah, blah. In Valachan's Guide, there's 2 shrines. They have to get and secure one of 2 shrines. In Mist Hunters, only one of them is active. And the cool thing I did here is that the misplaced, at least one of the misplaced, had completed, I think it's the Thrikreen, had completed the Trial of Hearts before and knew how to get to the shrine. And then Chakuna says, no, this Trial of Hearts have decided only Kuru Island shrine isn't active. And then the misplaced are freaking out because they had a whole plan to go to the other shrine and now they have to throw all that out. And there were a few rules that were specific to my players and my group. She said the use of things like Windwalk and a teleporting ship are banned. Sorry guys, you got to go through and battle the jungle on this one. And just in case it was needed, Chakuna's stat block. Valachan's Guide suggests Werepanther, which is Were-Tiger, obviously tweaked to be reflavoured as a Werepanther. What I decided instead, because my players are high level, is I went with the Relentless Juggernaut from Valachan's Guide, but I gave it Werepanther traits. And in Mist Hunters, the Werepanthers, their arrows are poisonous as well, so they do additional damage, so I used that for flavour as well. Then we get to the trial. Now, I'm not going to basically talk through the entire trial as it's laid out in Mist Hunters, because you can get that yourself. I will, however, talk about a few highlights and give a rough overview of how it pans out. So, and then just to reiterate again, for the maps, I use the expanded map packs, and I'll show a couple of examples here, or maybe as I go through, explain the Trial of Hearts, the maps that I used and how they look. So the cool thing about Mist Hunters is it gives a scoring system. So the longer you take, the less points you get. The quicker you are, the more points you get. The more points you are, some stuff can happen. The fewer points you get, or if you go into the minus, you risk getting caught by Chakuna. It makes sense. So if a battle takes a while to defeat, or you go at a slow pace, or you decide to stick around, there's one battle, one encounter where you can just ignore it, or you can go on. If you do something about it, like you rescue the person or you attack the monster, you lose points. If you just ignore it, you gain points, stuff like that. And if Chakuna catches up to people, trigger warning now for amputation, she takes an arm. She says, I can either take a heart or an arm. What are you going to do? You can either die or I can take an arm. And that's what happens. So she takes an arm then, and then there's a whole thing about, there's a mechanics for what happens if you have only got one arm. You obviously can't wield 2 weapons. You can't wield a shield and a weapon, and dexterity checks with 2 hands are at disadvantage, stuff like that. And then if it comes to it, there's prosthetics are a magic item. I think it's in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, but might be in other sources as well. And I later added a prosthetic stall to the Carnival's Litwick market. So if they knew if they lost an arm, they could potentially get another one at a cost later on. The Mist Hunters Trial of Hearts, the monsters they come across are things like there's a Hydra battle, basilisks. Actually, there's one point where there's two paths. You can either encounter a Hydra or basilisks, depending on which way they go, how they handle the travel through that section of the jungle. There's a zombie clot and zombie limb swarms. They're both from Van Richten's guide. What I loved about this is I included a zombie clot in Volkovnia. They defeated it really easily. Didn't even land a hit on them. I was gutted. And then when they encountered the zombie clot in the Trial of Hearts, it got some big hits on them. So I was like, yes! Finally had my happy DM moment. There's a body taker plant and podlings, also from Van Richten's guide. My players decided to ignore that. They just thought something was fishy straight off the bat. There are Displacer Beasts, obviously, because of Yana, Chakuna's pet, plus others that hunt with the Panthers, giant wasps, and a few others as well. It's even got suggestions of additional random encounters or extra encounters you might want to throw at the players. One of them made me laugh is 2 giant apes. Giant apes have a really high challenge rating, so I wondered if that was a typo or they meant to say just 1 giant ape. Having 2 giant apes would be pretty brutal, actually, I think. I'd be really unlucky to get that, but that was something I found quite amusing. I ended up doing all the encounters. So the way it's designed, it's split across 2 modules. So if you were doing Adventurers League style, it'd be 2 separate sessions. And the idea is that DMs running these only do maybe 2 or 3 of the encounters. They either pick and choose, or they choose a few and they can cut 1 or 2 because it's time dependent. But because we were doing it as part of a campaign, and because my players are higher level, I did all of them. So I did I think there's 7 or 8 altogether you can do. And I even included one that was just basically random encounters as well. I made some of them a bit trickier because of the higher level and because they had quite a few NPCs with them, including the hidden Erasmus, which was quite fun at times. I said, oh, you're fighting this Hydra and you see something attacking it from behind, but you can't see anything. So later on they were trying to figure out what this thing was that was helping them, and one of them cast see invisibility, saw this teenage boy who is a ghost, or poltergeist if I want to be more accurate about the stat block, but you get what I mean, and was freaking out then, and he was going, and pointing at Van Richten and shush as if he didn't want Van Richten to know what was going on, that he was helping him. A few of the highlights of the encounters, the Hydra was fun because one of my players has a vorpal sword and was like, oh, I'm going to chop off some heads. There is an encounter where Telako, that's one of the Kaspishi, one of the Shuaran people, is trapped. And you've got to decide whether to rescue her or leave her. You're not supposed to help out competitors. And this made it even harder for my players because I made her Yorana's cousin. So they were like, what should we do? And they decided to help her. And if you help her, it's an automatic. Talako's grabbed by vines as you escape and is killed off screen, and Chakuna shows up. So they were actually doing pretty well at that point, but that was an automatic Chakuna appearance, and would have had Van Richten volunteer to lose an arm, but my player whose decision it was to save Talako was the one who said, no, take mine. And he lost an arm. The cool thing about the module is it says, don't go into great detail. You don't need to go into the gory details of losing an arm. You just I just described it as that happens and explained the mechanics of what that would mean until they got a prosthetic. They decided to avoid the body taker plant, but what I did instead is they came across a family of saber-toothed tigers. But the saber-toothed tigers didn't attack them. They were going and sniffing them as if they could recognize a scent on them. And after a couple of my players have access to, not my players, sorry, an NPC, and then a player later on, we had a player rejoin us later on, I'll get to that later, has animal friendship and speak with animals, and said, did you have a sister or a daughter who went missing some months ago? And they said yes. And the NPC, it was Jennifer Weatherby Foxgrove, said, oh, she's alive, she's with us, but not with us right now, but is in Shuaran. Do you know the town or small village, on the coast? Yes. Well, you can reunite with her. And they said thank you in terms of I think the way Speak with Animals works is they speak in a very sort of plain way as an animal with low intelligence would do, and I think it's sort of follow us, safety, sanctuary. And one of the possible encounters you can include at any point you want in the Trial of Hearts in Mist Hunters is a sanctuary where you can short rest. Obviously it chews up some of your time, so Chakuna can catch up to you. And it's essentially flavoured as a gold dragon's resting place. A gold dragon got sucked into Valachan and sacrificed itself, refused to be defeated by the jungle, sacrificed itself so that people there could have a safe place to stay. And Chakuna, because of the magic around it, can't detect it, doesn't know about it. So they're able to short rest there. They take there's some canoes and stuff, and depending on how long it takes to arrive. They're either all there or some have been taken already, some have been sabotaged. They can then sail to Kiru Island, and there's a whole mechanic about a storm that can hit. And then one of the encounters when they get to Kiru Island is they encounter one of the misplaced who's wounded in the middle of a opening. And she's like, oh, my scumbag team members have left me here, said I was slowing them down. Displacer Beast got me. And it's the Vistana Bard, and my players had high enough passive perception that they see I said they see like a bluish greyish shape hidden behind a tree, which they were like, that looks like a GIF. And they were like, this is a trap. And then all of a sudden it was like, they're onto us, attack! And it's such a fun battle. You have the Thrikreen dives out of, there's a big pile of dinosaur poo, which is kind of a hint to what comes up right at the end of the Trial of Hearts. The Thrikreen dives out of the pile of dinosaur poo and just goes wild and starts attacking. The pirate is invisible. The bard has some cool abilities. The archer's firing arrows from the trees. Who am I forgetting? The GIF has a frag grenade, and the first move it's supposed to do is throw a frag grenade, which is obviously a big bang alert to Chakuna. Oh, it's so much fun. In the end, in my game, I was a little disappointed. One of my players decided to cast suggestion on Boeen, who's the bard, who was kind of treated as the leader and the one in charge of them, and basically said, you need to get out of here. And she's like, okay. And then she left, and all the others were like, oh, you should probably leave her. I didn't want to punish the player by having the rest of them continue attacking, because I thought that was a clever move. And so they go and run off, but obviously that means they're going to get caught and killed by Chakuna. The only one they managed to defeat and kill was the GIF, and I think one of my players he had a pistol, pocketed that. But wanted more frag grenades, I was like, sorry, he's only got the one, gutted. There was also a battle on Kiru Island before they got to the shrine. I think the thing suggests having man traps and displacer beasts, and there was a man trap that tried to lure the PCs and NPCs, and I had a tree blight come to life next to it, and my players were like, oh god, no, and I've got to fight this thing. But the tree blight, instead of attacking the players, attacks and kills the man trap, and then becomes a tree again. And they were like, huh, that's weird, that just helped us. That thing just, one of the parts of the jungle defeated another part of the jungle to help us. And that becomes clear later on when Urik's introduced. Oh, there was also a cool thing that was explained. There's a Death's Head plant, where there's Death's Heads in Valachan's Guide to Ravenloft, and they're reflavoured as being the hearts of former failed participants in the Trial of Hearts. These heart plants from these trees come off and can float and can attack the players, and they're the gnashing variety as well. So they've got teeth or some way to be able to like bite the players, which is really weird, but great fun on the imagination front. They get to the shrine. I use this map for the shrine, not the one from the expanded map packs. This is from 2 Minute Tabletop, for those of you familiar with his work. And as they get onto the shrine, they hear heavy footsteps, and they see a Tyrannosaurus Rex. This is reflavoured from Tomb of Annihilation. There's a named Tyrannosaurus Rex called King of Feathers, but it's tweaked even further for Mist Hunters. It wears gold armour, so it's got a high AC, and it can fire laser beams from a ruby from his forehead. Fair enough if you don't include dinosaurs in your version of Valachan, but I saw this and was like, I am including a armoured dinosaur firing laser beams, come on now. And it's got legendary actions, and one of the legendary actions as well, if you use all 3 of them in one go, is its fire beam attack attacks everyone in range. So there was like every single NPC, and it can see invisible creatures as well, so it could hit Erasmus. And if any of the PCs thought, cast invisibility to get away from it, it could still target them. So that was a lot of fun. It was a shame. Maybe I should have included some minions, because they did defeat it pretty quickly, even with the high EC. But it's still a great and fun battle nonetheless. After that, some of the Kaspishi, it's scripted in Mist Hunters, also show up right at the end as well. But I said they all disappear and get killed off screen one by one. And Chakuna arrives and congratulates the winners, the PCs and NPC allies of this Trial of Hearts. The Kaspishi are all dead, the Misplaced are all dead, and these are the winners. And she says if they want, there's a tiny slither of a amber vestige poking out of the top of the shrine, and one of my players checked it, and there's a dark gift in the Scion of Darkness, where it essentially can make you a better, stronger hunter. I can't remember the specifics offhand, but there's obviously a catch, because there is with the dark gifts. So none of my players or NPCs took it, but they were wondering if that's what was giving Chakuna her powers, so that was quite interesting. And that was the end of the Trial of Hearts, which was so much fun. I really enjoyed running it. I think my players enjoyed it as well. At that point, using the teleporting ship, they go as a collective, including Chakuna, back to Pantara Lodge, where they reunited with the Rictavius tiger, who meets his... at that point he hadn't met... I keep saying he. She hadn't met her family, but they explained, oh, we saw your family. Yorana's sad because she knows if these guys survive, my cousin is dead. But that kind of thing of like, nope, my cousin knew what she was signing herself up for. She knew she could have died. I'm just glad you guys won it and not the misplaced. She couldn't one day say, oh, I wish my cousin had won, because it meant all these other people would have died. She's kind of just glad that either the Kaspishi or the PCs won. And at that point as well, I only had 2 players, but a player who had to leave the campaign for a while wanted to come back. And that was the great time to reintroduce her. She arrived into Shuaran, met Yorana, recognised recognised Rictavio's tiger, and was back. And now I had 3 players and 3 PCs. Chakuna congratulates them again. They have a feast. She says, my castle is your castle, whatever the saying is. You are free to stay here for as long as you want. Victor's the Trial of Hearts. But I feel a sudden urge to hunt. Maybe it's the full moon, and it did funny enough time that the full moon was like the day of or the day after the Trial of Hearts. Me and my were-panthers want to go and hunt. And everyone, maybe this was a bit like, made it a bit easy for the players and a bit contrived, but all Chakuna, her were-panthers and her displaced beasts all left. And she said, make yourselves a home. And at that point, the players could explore and see if they could find clues. And they found the treasure pile just off the stables. I included the magical machete that's mentioned in the Mist Hunters module. This is really important for later on because one of its abilities is it can help you to cut through the jungle thicker so it's no longer difficult terrain. And then they hear a man crooning, and he's saying something like, oh, I can help you defeat Chakuna. And they follow the voice and they get to the place where on the map that was made by Mad Cartographer that there's a secret door, and they find what's left of Urik von Kharkov. And Van Richten correctly identifies him, recognizes him straight away. I used art from the early editions, and it was quite fun. For when I made the token, the way that the art, because it's black and white and the way it was made, if you position it in a certain way, it actually just looks like a head with, because there's white here, where you're like wearing white clothing there, and then it goes black. It actually just looks like a floating head. So it was perfect. I used that for when it was just his head, and then later when he got his body, I zoomed out a bit so it showed like as if he was wearing, like, it was the way the clothes were cut. I used the Nosferatu stat block from Van Richten's Guide because I saw that he was kind of described more as a Nosferatu than a sort of regular vampire, but still with werepanther traits. So instead of transforming into a bat, I had it they could transform into a panther, which is pretty cool. So he was I think his backstory is that he was a panther, that then became a werepanther, that then became he was a panther that became a werepanther and then became a Nosferatu vampire. So his stat block was quite interesting. I roleplayed him as sort of comic relief, not in silly slapstick, but just kind of more morbid and macabre kind of humour. There was one point where I said something and went, ha, he went, ha, no pun intended, because I think he said something like, this plant has legs. And at that point, he was just a head. He was telling them how much he hated Chakuna. This was humiliating for him just being a head. He heard that there was, he still has some control over the jungle, and he wanted to make sure that you guys won. And that's why the tree blight came alive on Kuru Island and helped them. It was his control, his limited control on the jungle. He proposes a deal. He wants Chakuna to suffer. He wants Chakuna to lose. He knows how you can defeat Chakuna. He will tell the players how to defeat Chakuna on 2 conditions. 1, they reunite him with his body, which is suspected to be in the ruins of Castle Pantara, and then they let him leave Valachan. He wants to be the first Darklord to be able to leave their domain. And one of my players pointed out, well, he's not really a Darklord anymore, and he's like, what do you know what I mean? He got a bit frustrated and flustered. Not that he could point with his hand because he didn't have a hand. And they agreed to his terms, and they took him in. One of them has a bag of holding, so they just put his head in there and occasionally get the head out and stuff like that. Another thing as well is if the body got destroyed, they had encountered the Rider's Bridge. So that was the Headless Horseman. So the funny thing is if the body got destroyed, Urik would have said something like, you don't happen to know another body walking around without a head, do you? And the players would hopefully say, actually we do. And that could have been a fallback, that they stick his head on the Dullahan or Dudahan later on. It didn't come to that, but that was a nice sort of backup if something happened to the body. I'll explain more about that next when we get into Castle Pantara. Now, Van Richten's Guide explains that it doesn't give much detail about Castle Pantara. It says that it's just ruins. When Chakuna took over, she, I think, basically burnt it to the ground or something like that. I decided instead that it would be unoccupied, in quotes, and abandoned. So there's a map in the adventure Falkovik's Cat, which was in Dungeon Magazine 50, and there's a map of the castle and its interior and all that jazz. I decided to recreate it in Dungeon Draft, and I'm going to have probably covering my entire face now side by side. of some of the different floors. Now, big disclaimer, I am not an artistic, I like to consider myself a creative person, but maybe not in terms of creating maps. Not a very artistic, graphic person. And, you know, they do the job, I think. They're not beautiful maps. I probably could have done more with lighting and shadow and maybe spent some more time on them. But I just wanted sort of the basic outline, if you will. I uploaded them onto Reddit, and I'll include a link in the description. One of the maps I don't think uploaded properly when I put it on Reddit, and I think that it wasn't like, you know, when you can go on it and then you can download it full size, it might look a little bit small and therefore pixelated or blurry. Therefore, if anyone wants it and the current version is not good enough, let me know. Maybe drop a comment here or on Reddit, and I will upload a version somewhere using a link, and then you can grab that. I also took some liberties. I knew with Urik guiding them that they would essentially go straight from the courtyard up to his room, which is up one of the towers. So I didn't bother doing the castle walls or the basement, the dungeon. So, quick disclaimer of that, but I did pretty much everywhere else. I tried to get it as true and as accurate as possible to match the original map. I had it as well that it would only be the PCs and Urik. Urik told them that Chakuna can sense activity in the jungle, such as deaths, and so if they all decided to go into the castle, she would suddenly sense, you know, oh, if there are any monsters lurking in the castle and they're defeated, she might sense them and pick it up. So what they did as a diversion is they sent all their NPC allies to fight near the castle, so that if there was, say, some deaths near the castle and then one in the castle, Chakuna wouldn't alarm Chakuna potentially. I even had a mechanic for how hurt the NPCs were, so I rolled 2 d20s, took the highest, and the higher the number, the less hurt they were. So one person rolled a 20, so I said they didn't lose any HP, any spell slots, but one person rolled like a 10, so they were down to like half HP, they used half their spells, stuff like that really. So in terms of using not just a map, but the info from Falkovik's cat, I took out some of the NPCs and some of the monsters. This is set obviously back in the days when Urik was the Darklord. The idea was that the players could go to the castle and fight him. He's got some minions, he's got some vampire spawn servants. They might even be vampires in their own right, I can't remember. But I did keep some stuff. So he's got a mechanical construct dog called Rolf, and I found art and a stat block for the Iron Defender from Eberron, from that book, Rising from the Last War. On one floor there's a doll golem, and it's described as being like a tin soldier, I think. So I was going to use the tin soldier from Witchlight, but that's essentially just a slightly tweaked animated armor from the monster manual. So you could just use the animated armor and change bludgeoning to piercing damage, because it's described as trying to bite the players. Lovely. There's a giant skeleton, I think that's from Ghosts of Saltmarsh I used, and it can cast Fireball, at least once, I think it's suggested. So the first move it did was it just flicked its wrists and boom, Fireball. And then the rest of the attacks were like, I think he's got a giant scimitar or something. Then they got to Urik's room and they found a headless Nosferatu in the coffin. And Urik's like, that's my body! Hey, buddy! But it reacts angrily. Now the cool thing about that part of the map, there's an L-shaped 10-foot deep, I was going to say moat, a pit I guess. And it's filled with poisonous snakes. So I used swarms of poison snakes in there. One player tried to like jump in to like climb out the other side and they were attacking him. Some players were able to like jump across the pit. One was able to fly across, and all they had to do was they had to try and get Urik's head back on his body, and they couldn't like attack or destroy the body because that could have caused problems obviously. So I had a mechanic where putting the head on the body was like an athletics check versus the Nosferatu's AC, and there was multiple times they rolled, and at one point they rolled a natural 1. And I have this thing where some DMs do it, and I know it annoys some players and maybe some other DMs, where if you rolled a natural 1, the worst thing can happen. I was in a game once where that happened, and I do a revised version of that where it's a lot less frequent, because I realised that for melee fighters, like a fighter versus say a wizard, you're more likely to get a natural 1 because you're doing more attack rolls, whereas a wizard might cast spells that require a saving throw. Anyway, so I changed it, so you've got to roll a natural 1 and a natural 1 on a d4 as well, so it's like a 180 chance instead of a 1 in 20. Well, one of the attempts to put the head on the body, a natural 1 on the d20 and a natural 1 on the d4, so I said it dropped in the pit. And Eric's head is like, I'm getting covered in snakes, help me! Which is hilarious, we all found it so funny. And I got this idea from someone on the Ravenloft subreddit, thank you. Nosferatus in Van Richten's Guide have an attack called Blood Disgorge, where they basically vomit blood. Sorry, gross. And I had it that Urik's head didn't do this. And Urik probably wouldn't do it if his head was reunited with his body. But Somebody in the Ravenloft subreddit suggested, what if the blood disgorge and content warning for grossness coming up squirts from the stump of the neck? And I described this to my players. My players are like, oh no, that's gross, but like really cool, funny gross. So that was good fun to include as flavor as well. And then they put Urik's head on his body, and he's like, oh, it feels good to get my arms and legs back. On their way down and back outside, a ghostly form appears, and he looks like an assassin. And he's like, we have unfinished business, Urik. And Urik's like, mortal, what are you doing here? And in some of the old like lore and adventures, there was an assassin called Mordal who I think betrayed Urik, or Urik betrayed him. And I had that he was then trying to attack Urik, and the PCs had to protect him. And it was funny as well, because at first my players thought it was like some sort of lover's tiff, that Urik and Mordal were lovers, and he was like, we've got unfinished business. And then as soon as they realised that Mordal wanted to kill him, they're like, oh, that's not good. So I had it as well that Mordal dropped, when his ghostly body disappeared, he dropped an actual corporeal dagger on the floor. And Urik picks it up and it's like, the Fang of the Nosferatu. This will come in handy for if we have to attack Chakuna and Werepanthers, because he then had a weapon he could use against them otherwise, because they're immune to non-magical damage. So if he was just doing his claw attacks, it wouldn't do anything. They waited until nightfall. The other NPCs returned, short rested, and they all, when the sun set, wind walked to Yaguara's heart. At this point, Urik hadn't told them where it was, so he just basically said, I don't want to take, because he'd have no leverage. They could just be like, right, we don't need you anymore. Actually, they needed him for the ritual, to be honest. So Urik essentially said, follow me, and led the way. They go deep in the jungle, and they go to Yaguara's heart. Outside, I used this map by, I believe, I don't know how it's pronounced, Chepeku or Cheempeku, and they do amazing maps that sort of like 3D-ish, almost sort of top-down. I used one for the Sea of Sorrows for the lighthouse, I used one for Demonio for the Red Widow Theatre, and I used this for the outside of Yaguara's heart. The door was closed, there's some runes and a stone pedestal, and I had a riddle. And I borrowed this online. I just saw somebody post it on Stack Exchange. The riddle was, always old, sometimes new, never sad, sometimes blue, never empty, sometimes full, never pushes, always pulls. And two of my players were stumped. One of my players immediately went, moon. I was like, I thought they would struggle with that. But just saying the word did nothing. And then they realised there's a good bit of doing, but they got there in the end with, they shone moonlights, they reflected from a mirror onto the pedestal. The doors opened. When the doors opened, I had some chols. I think it's pronounced chol. Funnily enough, I was going to do the D&D Beyond pronunciation button, but D&D Beyond is down right now, typical. So there were 4 chols as well that kind of came charging and attacking that they had to fight as well. Inside, I used this map by Mad Cartographer for Yaguara's Heart that was designed especially for this. I actually doubled the size, so I found that it was quite small. I knew there was going to be a big epic battle by the heart with Chakuna and some Werepanthers, and the way it's designed, it would have just been too small. The labyrinth is the default, it's just basically 5 foot wide corridors, but by doubling the size, it made it 10 foot wide, made the chamber at the sort of northeast with the heart a lot bigger. The only issue, I guess, is that it made the heart look comically big, but I suppose that's just kind of one of those details where on the map you can just say, it's to make it look obvious, or maybe as part of the ritual, the heart grows in size once it's outside of Chakuna's body, or whatever. On the map on the west is a treasure chest, which I just put some potions and gold in, but they didn't go that way. To the north, I had a water weird in the water. That's a fun tongue twister. And I would have had some Grix and a Grick Alpha jump down from like the side of the cavern and attack as well. They didn't go that way, sadly. They went east and found this big room with a long acid bath, and we're like, this is strange. And then carried on. And as they started navigating the labyrinth, one of them stood on a pressure plate. Now, one of them's got a passive investigation of 20, and they had the DC set to 21. And they even manually rolled to look for traps, but got a 20. And so I had it that just as one of them went to step on it, she was like, no, watch out! And she stepped on the pressure plate, which I said was hidden by vines. And something happened. They didn't know what happened straight away. The 3 PCs were in the lead. And then they heard everyone behind them like going, ah! And it was because that acid bath contained 4 gelatinous cubes. And despite being a player of D&D since 2018, I think, and a DM since 2020, I had never played or fought against or run gelatinous cubes, the classic D&D monster, so that was a lot of fun. One of the NPC allies cast Entangle, which I thought they'd be able to escape from, but I looked at the stat block and I think they're not immune to restrained, which I found quite surprising. And Entangle restrained them, which meant they were able to pick them up from a distance and really slow them down because they got quite a slow speed as well. So, but it was still fun, and they were still freaking out. And what I had as well is if they actually made it into the labyrinth proper, I would roll a dice to see which way, roll a d6. If I got a 1 or 2, they go west. If I got a 3 and 4, they go north. If they go, they probably wouldn't have gone backwards. So I would have done differently to that, but you get the idea. And it would have been great if, say, there was an NPC or PC trapped in a dead end and this gelatinous cube is just slowly approaching them. But it was not meant to be. They reach the northern chamber. They see the heart. Urik's about to tell them a ritual. From the stairs, they hear a woman shout, "What is the meaning of this?" And they see Chakuna, Yana, and a bunch of werepanthers. First, I had Urik just go, "Surprise!" which I players found funny. Maybe that's not in the spirit of how most classic Ravenloft DMs would run Urik, but I don't know. It's very in the spirit of how I was running him. And Chakuna says, "You've seen too much. You know too much. I can't let you live." And then there was the Battle of Chakuna. They knew at this point that Chakuna, they could sort of kill her in terms of, not permanently, but I had it that if she was killed, it would subdue her for an hour. So they knew that they didn't have to run away or try and do the ritual while the battle was going on. They could stop her and then worry about the ritual afterwards. I had it that whoever killed Yana, her Displacer Beast, she would be furious and try and take down that player. Originally I was going to have it be Yaguara, the NPC scout, who then would have been mincemeat. But my very high AC, high HP Paladin was the one who landed the final blow. So Chakuna was directing all of her attacks against him, and he did take a few hits, but he was managing to stave off the worst of it. The Relentless Slasher stat block I used for Chakuna, Relentless Juggernaut stat block I used for Chakuna has some legendary action abilities where she can cause this flying shrapnel and flying stone. One of them incapacitates NPCs and PCs, and the other one causes a wound effect where at the start of every turn, until it gets removed or healed, they take necrotic damage. So that was kind of cool flavor as well. I had it that she was kind of making the stones from the chamber, and if it happened in the jungle, maybe some of the terrain of the jungle was attacking them in this way. They defeated the werepanthers. The werepanthers at one point tried to retreat when they were on HP, and Chakuna rolled an intimidation check to get them back in the fight. They all got defeated, ending with Chakuna. And when they defeated Chakuna, I said to them that before she collapsed properly, she was weeping. And her last line was, "I only did what I did to try and keep my people safe." And that's when she died. Urik then explains the ritual. And I basically borrowed the information from Van Richten's guide, where you have to remove your heart and place it on a pedestal and consume Chakuna's heart, which is what Chakuna did to Urik originally. And the players were all I had Urik be like, "Oops, did I forget to tell you that bit? Whoopsie. I did tell you how I'd defeat her, and I never had to mention the fact that one of you would have to sacrifice yourselves to become the next Darklord. Well, cheerio, I'm off now." And I was going to have him leave, but the players refused to let him leave. So he rolled a higher initiative. I got him to transform into a werepanther, and then there was this mad chase out of the dungeon, which made the labyrinth really fun as well, because he was trying to which corridor did he take and stuff like that. And one of the PCs, the Were-Raven, turned into Were-Raven Hybrid, got 50 flying speed, chased him out most of the way, and then I had him hide outside, and his hiding was enough that the PC, when they got outside with a couple of NPCs, said, "We're wasting too much time here, we've got less than an hour to sort out Chakuna, decide what we're going to do about this ritual." One of them rolled a retroactive, I never remember which word, insight check on Urik to see if he was telling the truth, and he got a natural 20. I said, "Well, yeah, he wasn't lying. There's no other way to do this. You can't destroy the heart." Urik as well explained that if you don't replace the Darklord, Valachan will collapse. Yaguara was going to volunteer herself. She was the scout from Shuaran, but Van Richten pointed out that would just mean the cycle repeats, instead of Chakuna and the Oselo people choosing all the Shuaran people to be victims and participants of the Trial of Hearts. The opposite would be true. Yaguara would favour the Oselo people, and the cycle would continue. Van Richten said, "I will do it. I'm an old man. I thought I was going to die taking down Strahd. I certainly never thought I was going to take down Chakuna as well. I'm an old man. I feel guilty for what happened when my tiger attacked the Vistani in the events of Curse of Strahd." I had it that he realised afterwards, Esmeralda made him realise that was a terrible and horrible thing to do, and he kind of snapped and was like, "Oh God, what have I done?" That kind of thing. So he harboured a lot of guilt about that. He said he would wait as long as possible to do the ritual until Chakuna came back. He would then do the ritual, try and give them as much time as possible in order to evacuate the villages of Shuaran and Oselo. And I had the talking tiger be like, and my family. And he's like, yes, and the tiger's family. To evacuate those people and get out of Valachan. And he would try and then make Valachan destroy itself. There were some sad goodbyes, not just the PCs and the players. I actually had at least one of my players was full on crying, which was, amazing. That thing if you feel horrible, but it's also like an amazing, I must be doing my job right as the DM if they care that much about these fictional characters. But also, there's Jennifer Weathermay Foxgrove, so Uncle Rudolph. She was devastated, and he said, I've got a revised deed in the shop, hidden in a secret compartment. The shop now belongs to you and Laurie. Take good care of it. And Erasmus as well. And one of my players managed to convince him that it wasn't a trick of the dark powers. His teenage ghostly son is following him. And he said, sorry for letting you die at the hands of Baron Metis. And at this point, my players had met but not defeated Alcio Metis, so they knew the connection. She's one of the people who wants to be the leader of Darkon, as detailed in my missions guide. He said, sorry that I didn't protect you. I was a terrible father in that regard. And please go with these guys. Live in their base in Barovia. Forget about me.
Hello, Steve here, audio only. Not long after recording this video, I realised at this point there was something else I meant to say that's really, really important. I gave the players the opportunity, if they wanted to be the one to take over Chakuna's role, essentially. Not that it had to be Van Richten. Van Richten was kind of the fallback. If they didn't jump at it, he would volunteer himself. Now, I know there's other people who suggest that the best way to do this is obviously one of the PCs takes over. So that's something you may want to bear in mind. I think in some campaigns or some tables, it probably works better than others. I think if you were doing it as a one-shot and people had created characters for Valachan especially, and one of them sacrifices himself to replace Chakuna, then that's great. When it's a longer campaign like I've done, I could understand my players' reluctance to sacrifice their characters, unless they wanted to play a new character or felt that this was a good fitting end for their character, I guess. But I didn't want to feel that they had to be the ones to do it. And I kind of thought that Van Richten made the most sense anyway. So I just wanted to make that really clear and really important. It wasn't the case that the NPCs volunteered themselves without giving the PCs chance. I did give the PCs chance to consider one of them sacrificing themselves as well. Okay, back to the video.
And then they had less than an hour, or as quickly as possible, to try and get everyone out to safety. So this was this sort of final part of the thing I kind of called like escape from Valachan. They had a windwalk and they had the teleporting ship, so they were able to do it fairly quickly. They windwalked back to the ship teleported. They decided to go to Oselo first. They went to Oselo, explained what had happened. Chakuna's mother's mortified and angry that her daughter's killed for now, and they explain that they're going to evacuate the people. And at first, Chakuna's mother says, absolutely not. And I explained to the players that they could see other Oselo people looking terrified as if they wanted to go with them. One of them rolled a high enough persuasion check that, in fact, I was going to say anything below a natural 20, and what would happen is that Chakuna's mum would agree that everyone else would go, but she would stay. She would say, like, oh, I heard a pirate once say something about staying with a sinking ship. I'm going to stay and support my daughter right to the end. But the persuasion check was a natural 20, and I said that she was like, fine, I'll go with you too. And they couldn't windwalk back to the ship because they had all these people. So they used the magical machete from Mist Hunters to cut through the jungle to make it quicker to get back to the ship. They then teleported from the lake by Oselo to Shuaran. They told the people in Shuaran, and they managed to get the people of Shuaran and the tiger's family onto the boat. Do things like animal friendship and speak with animals helped on that front. And then I had it that if they did Oselo second, evil Van Richten would appear with a small army of blights, twig blights, needle blights, vine blights, and attack the players, but then also have this kind of, because it hasn't fully made him evil, he'd be like, no! And instead of killing the monsters, he'd knock them out, which doesn't satisfy the criteria for, the jungle needs blood, death, it needs dead monsters, not knocked out temporarily monsters. So he would then be, causing the domain to potentially destroy itself. Instead, because they did Shuaran second, Oselo for Shuaran second, I said that as the ship left the dock, Van Richten appeared with this army of twig blights and saw them off. As they went to leave through the mists, I saw that there was like a projection, almost like the dark powers showing them something else that was happening in the domain, and it was Urik stood at the mist border elsewhere where there was land, and he was like, to be the first Darklord to leave their domain. Even if that wizard did say, I'm no longer a Darklord, it still counts. And then he name drops as well. He says, I'm going to go back to Darkon and rejoin the Kajat. I wonder if Elsio's still around. And he goes to leave through the mists, and the mist pushes him back, and he says, what's going on? No, I'm trapped here. I'm still trapped here. I'm not even the Darklord anymore. The wizard said so. Curse you, dark powers. And then they see the domain collapse below him and he disappears in this collapse. They look behind them and they see the mountains and the jungle, everything just collapsing, even the sea below them collapsing as the sea goes through the mists, leaves Valachan, enters the mists proper, and Valachan is destroyed behind them. And that was Valachan. And that was actually the end of the last session. We got a session tonight as I record this, where they've got a ship full of the Oselo people, Shuaran people, and 4 saber-toothed tigers as well. And they've got to decide where to put them. I think they're going to send the saber-toothed tigers to Markovia. That was the wise talking tiger's decision. And they could potentially also be granted sapience by Dr. Markov, Dr. Fran in Markovia. And I think at the moment, because of Victor Valakovich, what happened after the business of Curse of Strahd, the Baron was killed, Lady Watcher was killed as well. The survivors, including the Baroness, Lydia, Victor's mother, decided to do a council instead of having one person in charge of a group. Because Victor was like, my mother's on the council. There's some empty houses in Vallaki. I think that's written into Curse of Strahd as it is, and says, why don't the refugees, at least for now, live in Vallaki? So they're going to take them to Vallaki in Barovia. And that was Valachan. I hope you found some of it or all of it useful, whether you just wanted a few quest ideas outside of the trial or you run the trial like the Trial of Hearts and Mist Hunters. And yeah, let me know what you thought. Let me know if you've run Valachan, if you did some stuff different. I'd love to know what you did. They went on Reddit when I asked for help. There's some people who've already run it and they shared some stuff that was really useful. So kudos to them. Or if you've got some questions for me or want to know any particulars, something maybe I didn't cover in this video, let me know. My next Ravenloft videos are likely to be how to run Esmeralda and Ferran, 2 NPCs, Mist Wanderers explained in Van Richten's Guide. I previously did Janda Sunstar the Vampire. I want to do Esmeralda, who's from Curse of Strahd fame, the Vistana, or not quite Vistana, I think I might change her lore in Van Richten's Guide, and Ferran, who is a lot of fun. My players have already met him once. They're going to meet him at least once more, and he's going to be involved in the endgame. He plays a very important role in my campaign. Other domains I'd like to cover in the future, I'm about to run Forlorn and Haslan. So Forlorn and Haslan are likely to be domains, but they're likely to be months away. I like to do these videos after I've done a domain so I can tell you the full story. So Forlorn I might be doing a few months' time, and then Haslan a few months after that. I could potentially do things like Markovia, Rider's Bridge, Naranjam, which I've also done, but I borrowed a lot from a lot of other people, and I don't want to just repeat what other people have done. They'd be short videos, but if people want them, let me know in the comments. Markova especially is probably got a bit more substance to it than Naranjan and Rider's Bridge. I essentially borrowed from PhD&D if you're familiar with him. So check out his videos. I kind of followed his suggestions for those and they were great. And if you enjoyed the video, please check out the second Tarokka reading. I think I only gave it a very brief mention in this video, but this is a Tarokka reading similar to the one that the players get into Curse of Strahd, where it leads them to 3 fated magic items, treasures, and a fated ally spread throughout all the domains they've read. It can lead them to any of the domains, major and minor, listed in Van Richten's Guide. And NPCs wise, it's Mist Wanderers are that NPCs listed in Van Richten's Guide. And there's a lot of NPCs from the older lore as well, from some of the novels as well. I read a lot of the Ravenloft novels recently and some nods and some mentions of those. It's currently free, pay what you want. It's suggested $10. If you can't afford $10, don't want to pay $10, only want to pay a few dollars or want to grab it for free, that's up to you. It may not be free, pay what you want forever. So if you do watch this shortly after this video comes out, feel free to grab it now. Otherwise in the future it might be $10 and that's the price. Thank you, Miss Wanderers. See you soon.